All right. Well, hello, Professor, and any of those that might be watching. My name is Paul Holcomb, and I'm going to be doing my presentation for you today concerning how many characters, or at least some characters of the Old Testament, are viewed as, well, basically being figments of our imagination or essentially not real historic people. And because of that, I want to talk about Job. Job's a pretty fascinating character, and really in this presentation, we just kind of want to look at Job and see first, is he historical fiction, and then ultimately, the question that lays before anyone that encounters scripture, and specifically the book of Job, is does that matter when it comes to, I guess, the theology of it all? Does it matter when it comes down to can we trust the Old Testament as being true on other things if it seems that there are imaginary characters within those scriptures? And so, Job, is he a historical figure or is he historical fiction? And so, before we really dig into that, I think it's helpful for us to really kind of consider who Job is. Now, Job is a character, well, within a book. He's not considered to be the author by many, but his book is contained within the Christian Old Testament. Of course, is also a book that's within the Torah for those of the Jewish faith. And to that end, Job isn't just for Christians that hold on to the Bible, but he is a prominent figure when it comes to Judaism. Just as we mentioned, he's a big character, a big figure within Judaism, Christianity, of course, and also Islam. Which it's so intriguing because those three religions share so many people, yet are so different in the way they the way they encounter who God is. But the other thing about Job is that he's also fairly culturally relevant. And by that, I mean that if you were to say to someone, oh, I'm suffering the trials of Job, there's a great chance they probably get that reference. People at least understand the synopsis of the book is that when it all comes down to it, there's a guy and he suffered a whole bunch. Beyond that, I don't know that the story is all that well known by many of the people we encounter. Also, Job's friends, they figure prominently within the story. And I think the idea of having friends like Job is something that communicates to some that you would encounter as well. And so Job isn't just isolated in history, and he's not really even just isolated within religion. He's a character that is in some ways pervasive within our popular culture, or at least culture. I don't know that I would say popular. The story of Job is an intriguing one. God is sitting up in his heavenly throne room or in his court, and he asks the question to someone called the Satan in Hebrew, or Satan. And he says, have you considered my servant Job? And really what he's saying there is, oh, I see that you have been considering my servant Job. And this starts this dialogue between Satan and God. And what Satan contends to God is that the reason that Job is so faithful and he's so righteous to God is because God continuously blesses him. And the theory that Satan sets out is that if you were to touch his life, if you were to take harm and not put blessings into it, but harm into his life, well, he'd curse you. He wouldn't be the righteous man that you're trying to uphold in front of me. And so God gives him liberty to go out initially to take things, to take blessings away from Job, but not to touch him. And so, to that end, in Job chapter 1, we have this, well, it has to be one of the worst days any humans ever encountered. In that, Job gets messages of losing property after property, but worse than that, he loses his family as a tornado or a whirlwind comes by and takes them and, well, kills them. And so Job, of course, doesn't, well, I mean, he doesn't take it great because nobody would, but he says, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. So blessed be the name of the Lord. And that's the quotation from scripture that I'm sharing with you on the screen. From there, though, Satan contends to God back in the throne room that they just haven't done enough. He said if you were to touch him, to touch his flesh, which God had prohibited, well, he'd curse you. And so this is what God gives Satan liberty to do. He allows him to touch him. He has boils on his skin, and he's pretty miserable. And it's at this point that his wife kind of turns on him in the sense of going, why don't you just curse God and die? And it's here where his three friends show up. And his three friends, they do a pretty good job for a short amount of time. It was said to me, and I firmly believe, that Job's friends were best when they were present, but they were silent. But unfortunately, the silence breaks and they decide to start talking and they start condemning Job. Ultimately, what they come up with is this idea that, well, if God's punishing you, if all these things are happening, you had to have sinned. And Job continuously says, hey, I haven't sinned, but that's the contention that they have. And why this is intriguing, and really why I'm sharing this aspect of the story as we go through, is because it has such similarities in the way that people think. By the time we get to the Gospels, when the disciples are walking with Jesus in John chapter 9, that's the question the disciples have. They run into a blind man, and the question that they lay to Christ is this: well, who sinned? Was it mom or was it dad? And even in our modern culture, this idea of karma, what have we done, or sin and God punishing us unless we make penance, this is something that so many people, whether they consider themselves religious or not, operate their lives by. But as they start to accuse him, this goes on for many chapters, and finally a man by the name of Elihu shows up. And at first, Elihu, he condemns the friends for essentially being bad friends. But then in turn, he starts to extol the greatness of God. He starts to extol the power and majesty of God. At the same time, he's condemning Job because, again, he had to have done something wrong. And from there, it gets to a point by the end of the book where Job finally starts demanding that God would give him an answer. And when God shows up in the whirlwind to give him an answer, he doesn't really answer anything. In fact, the main question that God has for Job is, where were you? Where were you? Well, number one, who are you? And number two, where were you? Who are you to question God? And where were you when I did all of these things? And he mentions creating the behemoth and the Leviathan. Yeah, he mentions the oceans and all things of creation. And ultimately, Job finally, by the end, comes to understand that God essentially does what he pleases. And again, he never really answers any of the questions, just knowing that it's really not dependent on us, it's dependent upon God, because he's holding the world together in ways we can't imagine. By the end, Job comes out of this depression. He has a new vision, a new sight of who God is. He knows that his Redeemer lives, and that casts forward into the New Testament as well. But with that, God blesses him. He restores more children, he restores more property, and we're led to believe that Job lives happily ever after. And so when it comes to Job, you'll see here on this slide, I shared with you, to me, one of the funniest quotations from a movie. It's from Tevye on Fiddler on the Roof. He says, you may ask, how did this tradition get started? I said, I'll tell you, I don't really know. I don't know. And what Tevye is saying there is that there's all these traditions in the Jewish faith that get started. And he says, I have no clue why we're doing them. It's just a tradition. And that's really the kind of point of view we have to take when it comes to Job. We obviously don't have any historical context or proof that Job existed. There are no documents, there are no archaeological finds, anything like that that we could use on our own to say, oh, here's Job, other than the Bible. Now, we do know, if we look, that there are existence of other Near East stories where you have similar stories, such as you have gods that punish an upright man. And those date back 4,500 years ago across the Egyptians, the Akkadians, and also the Sumerians. So this is not a story that hasn't been told by other cultures. And the question, of course, is who has it right, or if anybody has it right, and it's just a story. And so that leaves many to believe, when they look to Job in this context with absence of all evidence, that Job could be a mythological character. Ultimately, it really depends on how you view scripture as to how you walk away with who Job is. For some, and specifically what I'm citing for you here, they'll look to a verse like Ezekiel 14, verse 14, which mentions Noah, and it mentions Daniel, and it mentions Job. And for those that are skeptical, what they'll tell you is, well, these are characters that cross cultures, like those other Near Eastern stories of Job. So Noah is represented in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and Daniel is a fictitious character who was in a place called Ugarit. And so Job, he's just one of those fictitious characters. And that's where they kind of land with that in the absence of evidence. Now, if we were to go back to what the Jews specifically thought about Job, we get lots of mixed messages. For the Talmud, which this would be the Babylonian Talmud, which is redacted around 500 AD. In there, and we have it listed here on the slide, you have the Bava Barta 14b, and it attributes Job as being written by Moses. And depending on where we think he is in the biblical timeline or historical timeline, whether that makes sense or not really is dependent upon that. The problem, of course, though, is that the very next page, 15a of the Bava Barta, you have these rabbis, Jonathan and Eliezer, and they state that Job was among those that returned from the Babylonian exile. And this would place him somewhere around 538 BC, which, of course, is 7 centuries or thereabout after Moses's reported death. If that's the case, then Moses couldn't have written it, and Job really isn't where we think he is in the historical and biblical timeline. But on the very same page, and this is where it gets even more confusing, it suggests in the reading that Job is not a real person at all, and that ultimately the book of Job is simply an allegory, a story that's supposed to teach us a lesson, excuse me, and show us a bigger picture of God and how he works. But also in that same portion, it tells us that Job was a contemporary of Jacob and Abraham. And interestingly, I think that in just the teachings that I've heard traditionally within church is that the idea that this man named Job was real, and this man named Job, he lived somewhere pre-Abraham, so somewhere in that Babel to Abraham place. Now, I don't have a citation for you, but I think it's just worth noting some of the teachings that do go on for those that are considering Job and whether he's real or not. And what's so intriguing about this book as well is that it sends such mixed messages when it comes to how we can interpret even where Job falls, dating wise, and when it was written. It's difficult to date because of the language that it uses. I think the phrase strange Hebrew is such a good phrase for this. This book of Job uses more unique words than any other Hebrew biblical book. And there's a lot of possibilities for that, because when we consider that Job is not Jewish and who wrote this and how this story came about could be impacted in a lot of different ways. But sticking to this strange Hebrew, what we find is within the story, within the language, it's archaic, like we have an ancient date because we have this old Hebrew, but also you find portions of it that are heavily influenced by Aramaic. And that would tell us that this was at a later date. And so we get these mixed messages when it comes to just looking to the Hebrew text of Job to try to consider where we can find him, more or less whether it was real, but just when the book was written. Now, there are theories of authorship and, of course, origin. Some would contend that this book was written by Arabian Jews, which makes sense, again, because these are people of the East. These are not Jewish people. So this isn't part of the tribes or anywhere near Abraham, Moses, or even any of the people that would be exiled. They would have to be somewhere else. Also, some believe this is just a poor translation from Aramaic. And so somebody essentially didn't have the chops to translate it. So they did their very best. And so we have this kind of chopped up language. Another theory, of course, is written in the Idumean language or Idumean language, Idumean. I butchered that horribly. You'll have to forgive me. This is what would be considered biblical, but a lost language of Edom. And Job not being a Hebrew helps support this idea. The most popular that it seems right now is that it's written by someone who their first language was Aramaic, but their literary language was Hebrew. And so they're speaking in Aramaic, but they want to write in a fancier language. So in the parlance of our times, it would be speaking, the English dialect, depending on where you live in our country, but then trying to use the Queen's English in order to write, or to write according to, say, like the King James Version writes, with a lot of these and thous. And because of that, while you might be effective, there's a great chance that you're going to drop a lot of things. It's not going to communicate in a seamless way. And the stipulation, or the support behind this, is that this use of archaic Hebrew was a deliberate usage. And what this does is it puts us at a date that would be, then near the Second Temple period. And so that's trying to date based upon language, but can we date the book of Job when we consider the theology? And so for some, we can ask the question, was Job written after the Babylonian exile? And the reason that question is important is because of the way that Satan is presented. Satan is presented as a member of God's council, and Satan is not mentioned in any of the pre-exile books. And so the idea would be that if we've never seen Satan at all, then why would he show up solely in this book before the exile? It would have to be after the exile, the Babylonian exile. Another question, another theory or thought, is that this is pre-4th century BC. And the support for this is that Satan is not presented as an all-powerful force, whereas in the book of Chronicles, Satan is presented as an all-powerful force. Another possibility, another question through the theology, is that there is a late 6th century BC or 5th century BC, early 5th century BC. Because when we have this presentation of Satan, he is very similar to how the prophet Zechariah writes in his book when he describes Satan. And so again, we're looking for similarities between the theology and also the dating amongst when this idea of Satan would have come about. And while this is kind of fraught with peril, because Job could be an outlier, they could talk about Job and set the stage for the way that later on people talk about Satan, it gives us an idea of kind of where it's at. And here's what we do know. We do know that when it comes to the book of Job, it was written by at least the 2nd century BC. And we know that because there's an Aramaic translation of Job found amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so we know that this is what we would call a biblical text. And we know that we at least have a date in which we can say, well, we know it was written by then. And so the question now is Job real? And to that end, we could see that Job is real for a few reasons, or at least we can make that assertion strongly, because Job reads like history, and the Bible itself treats Job like a real person. It doesn't treat him like a figure or a symbol. And in turn, we kind of look at this internal witness for the book of Job within the Bible. Job was fixed among the canon centuries before Christ, and Jesus endorses the Old Testament canon. He talks to us about all of these books, the law, the prophets, and of course, these wisdom books. And then we have the Apostle Paul, which he also endorses the Old Testament canon. And we'll talk more about him, but when it comes to the Apostle Paul, he learns at the feet of Gamaliel, a still well-respected rabbi. His education in the Torah was bar none better than nobody, but we would contend other than Christ, who would be the author himself. And so when he endorses that Old Testament canon and never points to the imaginary or the allegorical within that canon, it can lead us to believe that Job is real, but we're going to kind of press down on those. So Job reads like real history when we compare, well, to other history and also to history within the Bible. The book of Job gives us really specific details concerning Job's family, his kids, his friends. They have names and suffering. It's not just 3 guys that show up. It talks about very real spiritual struggles, and it really doesn't, read like, well, some sort of, just symbolic literature. And again, when it comes to the Bible, he's never presented as a figurative or a symbolic person. Now, there is also another way to look at this as history, because it's a very realistic opening when it comes to Job chapter 1 and verse 1. If you compared this to, say, to Judges chapter 17 and verse 1, and I'll read that for you, there was a man of the hill country of Ephraim whose name was Micah. Now, when we consider that, I'll read for you Job chapter 1, verse 1. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. And so you see that one-to-one comparison. But also, I'll just read for you 1 Samuel 1, because we see, Judges chapter 1, because we see much the same thing. There was a man of the hill country of Ephraim whose name was Micah. And we'll stop there. But we see that there's this comparison to the way the Bible, specifically the way the Old Testament, tells us history. And that is an aspect of what the Old Testament is historical record. And Job reads very much like that. The Bible also treats Job as a real person. He is linked throughout the history. Job is mentioned in Ezekiel chapter 14, verses 12 through 20. Now, I touched on this earlier because one point of view, one perspective is all of these people are mythical, that none of these people are real, and this is just based upon other Near Eastern stories. But the other perspective that we can take is the fact that, hey, they're all historical figures in the Bible when considered by people who read the Bible. Noah, of course, is, Noah of Genesis chapter 6 fame, and he's the one who built the ark. There is Daniel, who is an exile in Babylon and rises to prominence within there. And Job being listed in that group. And this is an if-then kind of conditional statement. If Noah and Daniel are real biblical figures, then Job, listed with no distinction, would have to be logically a real historical figure as well. But the other thing too is that Job's treated as an authority. We find this in James chapter 5, verses 1 through 11, and I don't want to read all that for you. I just want to read the 11th verse. But I also want to say this before I read it. When you look at James, we believe that this book is authored by the half-brother of Jesus. And historically, this James is known as what we would call a Jew's Jew, meaning that he was in it to win it when it came down to the law and understanding the Torah. And so in that case, if he treats Job as a lofty character to appeal when he writes this book that's attested his name, then that gives us some semblance of Job has to be a real person. But in verse 11 of James 5 says, it says, "Behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful." Now, I don't want to fall into the trap of making modern day comparisons, but in the sense that if I were to refer to you as a lumberjack of Paul Bunyan, then you would get that lumberjack wasn't real. But if I were to contend to you somebody that worked in the logging industry that we might know, Teddy Roosevelt, and say, okay, well, he's big on these parks and give you some wisdom from him, those would be two different things. One person we know spent time in the outdoors. The other gives us a weird explanation, kind of cartoonish, on how we got the Great Lakes. And so because of that, you say that, hey, this is an appeal that James would make, not to a fake individual, but to a real one. The Apostle Paul also uses text from Job in 1 Corinthians 3:19, and that's just him referencing Job chapter 5, verse 13. And I won't read that for you, but if Paul's going to quote scripture, it's odd that he would do that as an appeal to authority to the church in Corinth if he didn't consider this Job being a real person. With the other things that he quotes, which comes from Greek plays and things such as that, but those are very common. When he points to scripture, it's always pointing to scripture as an authority, not as a fictitious element. And so the question that we kind of land at is, well, does it really matter? If Job is allegorical, is that detrimental to our belief in the Bible being true? And I think it's definitely a worthy question of asking, and we'll kind of attempt to answer it, well, the best that I can. When we look to Job, it's important to know what Job is trying to do, at least as the book, not Job, the human being. I have on here a slide that comes from a teaching from the Bible Project. He's one of my favorite Bible teachers. His name Tim Mackey, and he has his doctorate in the Hebrew Bible. And so puts together these very easy to understand tutorials. But in here, he talks about Job and captured this for you. It's a unique book in the Bible. So it's set in Uz, which is far away from Israel, which that's different. That's different than we'd be dealing with somebody else. Also, all the characters are not Israelites. So all of a sudden we have these outliers outside of the camp of Israel, yet still believes in the one true God, which is this kind of like drawing it together. And so then that we see that there's really no clear historical setting given. And what Mackey contends is that this is intentional. What the author wants us to focus on is not proving whether Job is real or not. He wants us to focus on the fact that there are questions raised by Job's suffering and where that puts us when uh, we're in this thing called life and we have this great cosmically big God and we're suffering down here on earth. And so nothing in Job tells us that this isn't historical. Now, we do understand this, that after Job chapter 3, all of a sudden the friends are there and they're talking in poetry and verse. And we do know that people don't talk like that. So we of course want to acknowledge that the dialogue and the discussions are stylized because whoever wrote it probably wasn't there. This would be, we contend, inspired by God, but not a word for word dictation of what happened that day. It's not a newspaper report. And the point, of course, is the struggle. And I think that's the interesting thing. When we look to the Old Testament, we look to books like Genesis and we consider creation, it doesn't seem that that's what God's intention was to prove to us that he understood the way that science worked and to answer questions about literal creation days or even dinosaurs. It's not that we can't try to search within those texts, but I don't think that's the primary point. And that's the same with Job. The point of Job isn't to prove to you that you should, one, listen to Job, and then two, actually listen to him. It's just to say, hey, here is a portrait of this man who lived, who was faithful, had a belief in this God, at the same time, had questions that he demanded answers from. And that's a story that communicates well across thousands and thousands of years. And ultimately, what we see when it comes to the book of Job is that we get a very big God for a really big world. I point to you that Job is not Jewish because when we think of the Old Testament, I mean, this is predominantly a story about God's chosen people. He starts a family in the book of Genesis with a man by the name of Abram. He gives him covenant promise. He changes his name. He forms through what we would call the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then eventually he has this huge family that he delivers in the book of Exodus from slavery. All of those people are God's chosen family. But embedded within the Pentateuch or the first five books is always these allowances for the fact that other people need to know this God too. And I think that's one of the cool things about the book of Job. Job, first and foremost, is not Jewish, which means that God always had an eye on the Gentiles. And that connects to the larger biblical narrative of which God would adopt us and graft us into his family, as the Apostle Paul tells the church in Rome. Job also, as we've said, he believes in the one true God, which means that when Paul says in Romans chapter 1, through creation, we can understand that God is there. And then in Romans 2, that through conscience, we understand that God does exist. It gives a little bit of power, a little bit of oomph to what Paul is saying. The other thing I'd add is that God is not silent on his power or our struggle. Ultimately, God is for his glory. That's what the Bible is really about. And it's not really about Job. Job is just one of many people that have walked this earth, I would contend being true. But it's about his power and human struggle. And ultimately, if Job isn't real, God is still communicating something by putting this book in. Because again, Job's not Jewish, so he speaks to all people. He's, believes in the one true God. So again, he speaks to all people, that God is there through our suffering. And of course, finally, as you see here, this is a wisdom book. It falls in line with books like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes that are designed not to be prescriptions for life in some ways, but to describe to us the condition of life, our souls, and that perspective when it comes to God. And so, ultimately, I do think that Job is a real historical figure, but I don't know that it matters to the greatest extent if I was proven to be wrong for a fact. And so, with that, just sharing with you the bibliography. Of course, you can read it for yourself, but some awesome stuff. I do want to note that Kitchens is highly silent when it comes to Job. And of course, that's because there's just nothing we can find from that early of a period. I do recommend for anybody, if you have the opportunity, to look to the Bible Project. Their videos are simple and they're insightful to not only the Hebrew, but also to what the purpose is of the Hebrew Bible. And then, of course, you can see through them there. Elon Gillard, Jason Jackson, John Piper, and Mark Woods. And so just want to thank you. And if I can stop the recording, I'm going to do that.